Hello, and welcome to the Ripley Recall. The Ripley Recall is a podcast created by the Camp Ripley Public Affairs Office to highlight and discuss the events and activities of Camp Ripley and the Minnesota National Guard, focusing on the people and operations that make up the many departments on Camp Ripley, interagency partners, environmental stewardship, major exercises in the surrounding community. The content of this podcast does not necessarily express the views and opinions of the state of Minnesota, the United States Army, or the Department of Defense. Welcome back to the Ripley Recall, a 40-minute podcast shared every week from right here in beautiful central Minnesota. I'm your host, Mr. Anthony Housey, U.S. Army retired, and with me today is First Lieutenant William Hermanson, Public Affairs Officer on Camp Ripley. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So I think a lot of things that people don't realize, that things that we'll look at today is, what is Camp Ripley? It's kind of this enigma that's along the highway that a lot of people drive by, but they don't really know what it is.
Yeah, we're kind of hidden out in the woods, aren't we? It's a primary training site for the Minnesota National Guard, and really all of our partners as well. We get a lot of other states, and we've got some state partnership programs with Croatia. We have the Norwegian exchange program, but we're about 53,000 acres of training space. We employ anywhere from 800 to 1,000 personnel, and we manage roughly 70 training areas, 45 live fire ranges, and 23 non-live fire ranges. And those kind of include the bridging sites, the urban structures, simulation, drop zones. There's just a whole lot to do on base that people think we are just a bunch of empty woods, and there's a lot of good, up-to-date facilities and state-of-the-art training facilities and modern user-friendly ranges that are downrange, and we're glad to see our partners use a little bit more of that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a little bit more to us than what folks see. So, down in the metro and whatnot, everybody's heard the stories of Fort Snelling, and Fort Snelling really was the initiation of the military or settlements here in Minnesota as we went through history. What are some of the advantageous parts, or what are some of the early parts of Camp Ripley's history?
Oh gosh, Camp Ripley has been here forever. Prior to even the 1930s, when most people knew it was here. I think it started at Fort Ripley was the original name, and we still have a town, Fort Ripley, right down the road. Right. I think there's only 60 people in that town, but it's still there, and there's still that debate that we had on that little Facebook thread we had of why people are confused between Camp Ripley and Fort Ripley. And for many years, the Fort Snelling was the primary base for Minnesota, but was it 1849? The Army decided, hey, we need something a little more north. And there's a lot of history of why we needed up here at north, and it was mainly because it's an important supply route, especially near that growing settlement areas up here in the Crow Ring area. Was built to originally be that hub, but then it became a buffer between the Dakota and Chippewa tribes, as well as to supervise some of the government payments of money on the Winnebago Reservation near that Long Prairie, Fort Ripley area. But it was more of a presence for that supply route and to show everybody that the Army was here in northern Minnesota, which not a lot of people saw.
Right, yeah. Settlement was really starting to grow at that time in the early 1800s, mid-1800s there. And, you bring up a good point. Camp Ripley, as we know it now, wasn't necessarily always Camp Ripley. That was something that came much later. But the Fort Ripley, that showed up, of course, like you're saying, in the mid 1800s, and survived for as long as frontier forts usually do. Yeah,
which aren't usually very long during that time period. Very, very dangerous time period for everybody involved in that area. But it disappeared for a while. It really did. And it was gone.
The frontier kind of moved on, and then the necessity for it for being there moved on as well. So
and then what is it? Roughly then the big war happened, right?
Right.
Well, after the Great War, and then the big war happened afterwards in the 1930s, and it was kind of a weird happenstance that it happened too, because Minnesota was kind of looked at a primary location for the Army because we model Eastern Europe. Our landscape really does. So we had a very small area of training down toward the cities in the 30s and the 20s, and that's where they primarily trained. But after a while, that just became too small.
Right.
So then the legislators and the politicians and the Army, and they all started kind of looking around, where in Minnesota else can you go? And I don't even, if I remember the story correctly, and your history buff as well to correct me, they did not remember that Camp Ripley or Fort Ripley was an actual training site before. They just kind of found the area. They thought it was a good training area. And then afterwards, when they decided, roughly 1929, that these 12,000 acres were great, let's buy it, let's put a training site. And then they realized, oh, this was a fort before. There's some buildings here, and we still have the ruins here today. They are ruined.
Yeah. Most of the settlers and farmers that kind of took over the area, made sure that they used the remnants of what the fort was. I think so.
I think material is just as hard to get back then as it is today, right?
Absolutely.
1930s they built up for buildings, utilities, ranges, roads, and in 1931, actually on my birthday, June 14th. Flag Day, and they started to begin training on it. That's when the opening was, and after a couple of years, airplanes were becoming important. They're getting a bigger piece of the Army's puzzle, and they created the airfield in 1933. So the 109th Observation Squadron, based in St. Paul, could come up and train with the Army soldiers.
Right.
That was an important piece of our warfare at that time. And this is, again, this is before we even thought that something big was going to happen. There were inklings in the country, but and you saw what happened in Europe and the uprising of certain individuals that decided to get into power. But nothing, we were still an isolationist country. We did not want to do anything else.
Yeah.
So we just were training a very small force at that time. Camp Ripley was not what it is now. It was mostly a tent city, tents, camps. Enlisted men would have to put it up and bring it down. Of course, the officers wouldn't help because why would we put up tents ourselves? So we have you guys do it, right?
Right, with a rifle range right out the back door. Almost like safety wasn't the issue so much, but convenience was more.
Exactly. Wake up in the morning, roll out of probably off the floor, off the sleeping bag and cot, and get in line and have someone yell at you and shoot down wherever there was an open area, and then get back and probably run a little bit was probably the only PT they did, and then go back to bed or hang out for hours. I mean, sit by the fire. And it wasn't, this is not too far off from when the Civil War happened, and Minnesota has a pretty rich history in the Civil War. And a lot of these guys probably had fathers or grandfathers that were in it.
Right.
So they're probably used to that, sitting by the fire.
Yeah, there were so many advancements that came following the Civil War, and then the Spanish-American War, of course, right? Then, especially the advancements in medicine and tactics and some of the formations and support elements there. Our Army had to change and had to adapt. And being a former soldier and seeing a lot of the soldiers nowadays, it's almost like, well, we've always had all this technology, we've always had all this convenience and whatnot, support of being a soldier. No, we had to come from somewhere, so we really learned the hard way and had to adapt to that.
Yeah, it's super interesting how that works. Now we have hot weather uniforms, right?
Right.
Compared to the day where they were just wearing straight wool in World War I and World War II and cotton, and now we have this thin layer material. And imagine in the Civil War, that was thick material. So it's really hard for the modern soldier to remember. Rifles were at some point in time only 5 at a time.
Right. They
were only 1 at a time. You had to stack it in. So it's cool that we have been such a big part of the Army, and Camp Ripley is a huge part of the Army and has been since its creation, recreation in the 30s. Training. This was an enlisted training post for World War II. So a lot of soldiers came through in World War II and did their basic training here at Camp Ripley, or advanced training here at Camp Ripley, and then they went overseas.
Right.
It worked well. So even in 1937, 1940, when we really got into training for large scale, and we started to realize as a country, this may be inevitable. We may be getting into a conflict overseas. Then we brought in people for large scale maneuvers. Again, we model Eastern Europe's landscape.
Yep.
So it was almost perfect.
Yeah, that element right there is something that folks nowadays have never seen, never experienced before. I mean, my predecessors did things like Reforge, or the return of forces to Germany, and did full-scale maneuvers across farm fields and communities and whatnot throughout Germany. You know, in the early part of the 40s there, they were doing army-scale maneuvers through 6-7 states. You know, the story coming through here is that, you know, an infantry regiment and infantry brigades would move through the town of Piers and camp off in some farmer's field and whatnot. That's something that nobody in the military now has really ever seen before. That's quite an achievement to be part of that operation. You know,
I imagine if, and most of, a lot of Minnesotans like to go patrolling in the woods and walking and finding. You find some trinkets out there. In
sure
the woods.
Do, yeah.
I mean, even me getting lost as a lieutenant in the doing land nav, I found some old 40 beer cans out there in Camp Ripley when I'm just walking around for hours. They were still the pop tabs.
Right.
They were the 40s beer cans that we found, and you're right. Go walk through the woods of Minnesota. You'll probably find some old stuff just dug in the ground.
There's plenty of history still out there,
yeah,
out and about. But yeah, into World War II, we we didn't have a ton of activity. We didn't have as much as Fort Snelling and some of the southern installations. Of course, weather being a concern with that. When the blizzard of 1942 actually pushed out the unit that was training here at the time, the 99th Infantry Battalion, which is the only active duty unit that was formed here, formed out of Norwegian Americans and whatnot. So our winter weather is even too much for training sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, and again, going back to the point where you said the soldiers aren't aware of maybe some of the things they didn't have back in the 40s, right? Heated buildings are they're great to have now,
right.
But they slept in tents. We have the tin huts still here for another couple of years, right? And I've stayed in there during the winter, and it's miserable. So I can't even imagine back in the 40s, and I can understand why they decided to move out and not do a lot of training here in 1943, especially after that blizzard. It's like, you know what? Minnesota's a little too cold, a little too snowy for what we can support. It's important training to do the winter training, and we see that now when it becoming a bigger piece for us. But back then, gosh, we can even tell about the Bastogne. The winter equipment was not readily available for everybody.
Right.
It just wasn't. Those guys fought in the Ardennes in the forest, and they didn't have gloves. They didn't have coats for, a couple weeks. So imagine that and doing basic training. It's not hardened soldiers yet.
Right.
Right. Just brand new people coming out of their farmhouses and training. I can understand it. And we're kind of jumping on that point for the winter operations nowadays, but the past always leads up to something in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Now we're well into it. Now we do all kinds of winter training. We actually seek out the most frozen place that we can find, but like you said, we have the heated buildings that we can finish off into.
After you're done being cold, let's go inside the T building and warm up a little bit, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. One of the elements here towards the end of World War II was that our current infantry division here in Minnesota was one of the pieces that helped us settle as the Minnesota National Guard. Following World War II, the National Guard kind of changed from the 34th Infantry Division into the 47th.
Yeah, what a storied history our infantry has in Minnesota. If you really think deep into it, right? This first Minnesota in Civil War, first boots on ground, and just coming from my heart, the artillery, first round fired in World War II.
Yep.
First boots on ground, World War I, World War II for the infantry
right.
in Minnesota. A storied history. But you're right. Yeah, we went from the 34th to the 47th ID for a while, and we decided to run with that for a while. And they did a lot of what we still do today, railhead. We do a lot of logistical support for the Midwest.
Right.
And that was kind of their bread and butter. We have a central location, and we still have it now. But that land also grew in 1951 afterwards, right?
Yeah, they kind of championed the whole, improvement of what we currently have in cantonment here on Camp Ripley, and then grew our training area. So we were able to do more specific maneuvers in kind of a secure area.
Yeah, and that's because the 47th ID were able to support that. And we actually had an infantry division in Minnesota dedicated to us. So they got up to, 45,000 acres and then in 1951, and then slowly bought more land. And now we're up to that 53,000 acres. And we've had that since the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And then they started building up the ranges, the railhead, more trails and roads, and not just for our use, but for civilian use as well, because we do have a lot of civilian partners
we do.
that come in. But it was a summer-only post at that time. Everything shut down in the winter. In the 60s, it still was cold.
Right.
In the 50s, they still didn't have it. We built the tin huts in about the 60s, too, which amazingly are still here, right? And they're great that they're still here because it's hard to get rid of that kind of history. And it's fun to see that the new privates and new specialists that come in still have to sleep in the tin huts. And I've done it too, and I know you've done it quite a few times.
Yep.
So it's kind of cool to be able to do that. But
falling asleep to rain on corrugated tin, it just it's
and waking up with puddles underneath, make sure your stuff's off the floor. But yeah, and in the 70s, we started to build up those year-round barracks because winter training was becoming a big thing, and seen some adversaries around the world that operate in the winter, and we just weren't good at it.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we took a few lumps, during the Korean War.
Mm-hmm.
As a force, as a total force, not just us, the Marines, everybody, experiencing winter warfare training again. I mean, you'd think that we learned our lesson from a lot of the operations in the later part of World War II. But here we are again, fighting an enemy that's prepared for winter combat operations, and we necessarily were not. So a lot of these camps and forts and training areas and whatnot had to redevelop that, and the 47th was a big part of that Cold War effort to re-engage cold weather training.
Yeah, and that's exactly what it is. We just, for some odd reason, didn't learn from our lessons, but now we are, and we continue to do it. And I'm glad we're one of the few cold weather bases, right? There's just not a lot out there,
right?
But we continuously try to improve our winter training ops and our facilities and everything, and that enables our civilian partners to train in the winter too, right? So we have a lot of state patrol. We have a lot of firefighters, a lot of EMTs, those first responders. They do a lot of winter training up here as well. Heck, we even have the Navy dive team and the Coast Guard school that come up here to do winter dive training. So
right, and that's been something that's just happened in the past 4 or 5 years, mm-hmm. right? I mean, that's something they tested out, and now they want to bring all their different organizations from around the country. Folks that dive in Hawaii on a regular basis, they want to come to negative 20-degree Camp Ripley and go under the ice.
Yeah, isn't it crazy that the past has always seen kind of 30, 40, 50 years in the future of, hey, this still might be a thing. And I'm really happy that the Minnesota has continued to push on that. And I don't know why they would come to want to dive in the cold wind or water, but apparently people do polar bear swims too. So
right.
Yeah, I don't know. People are crazy. That's just me.
Well, good. Well, sir, I think we're going to take a short break and listen to our folks from the Minnesota Army National Guard, and we'll be right back with the Ripley Recall.
Meeting the basic requirements, that's what the rest of the world does. Contributions come easy. Commitment, on the other hand, is hard. True commitment takes a concerted effort on your part. Working hard and giving 100% is your commitment. You will find that day when your muscles ache, your joints are sore, and you don't know how you will carry on. It is in that moment when you look deep within yourself and find that which motivates you to drive on. You will not accept defeat because quitting is not in your nature. Instead, you will pick yourself up and show the world your level of commitment, because that commitment is at the core of who you are. It takes drive, the kind that doesn't fade when impossible obstacles are staring you in the face. How badly do you want to succeed? This is about commitment. A commitment to yourself, a commitment to those around you, and a commitment to make a difference. You will succeed because you are America's future. There must be a willingness to march a little further, to carry a heavier load, to step out into the dark and the unknown for the safety and well-being of others. Now that, my friends, is commitment. We live here, we work here, we serve here. We are the Minnesota Army National Guard.
Welcome back to Ripley Recall. I'm Mr. Housey, Camp Ripley Public Affairs, and I'm also with Lieutenant William Hermanson of the Camp Ripley Public Affairs Office. We're talking through some of the history of Camp Ripley and we came from and where we're going. Sir, I think when we left off, we were talking about winter operations training and some of the elements that we kind of created from that, and of course the things that we're doing nowadays with all these different out-of-state units, and of course our Minnesota National Guard that come up here for winter operations training. We also deal internationally with some winter operations training, have since 1974. Is that right?
Oh yeah, this winter training ops has been our bread and butter, right? But who does it better than most of us is Norway.
Right.
They live in this stuff, all year round. So back in 1974, they're two veterans of the World War II, an inspector general, Norwegian inspector general, and a major general. The inspector general for Norway is, I think, Herluf Nygaard, and the other general was Major General Francis Greenleaf, and they shook hands. And that's all it was a conversation. Hey, let's create a program that we can share our knowledge and our training and our cultures. Right. And it's really easy for Minnesota to share Norwegian culture, right? Most people up north are of Norwegian descent. So then under the guidance of Major General, I think, Seiben, at that point in time, he was the Adjutant General for Minnesota. Personnel from the Norwegian Home Guard, which is their equivalent of our National Guard, were to take part and become familiar with each other's weapons, equipment, how they organize their training, operations, and their different exercises. And we continue it to today.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're almost at 49 years, I think, Tony, isn't it?
Yeah, coming up on the big 50 here shortly. But yes,
yeah. So it's crazy, and gosh, what a great partnership we have. I spent my first a couple minutes in Valhalla yesterday, the governor's cabin, and gosh, showing my wife around and seeing all the trinkets and the gifts that I've shared between the two nations throughout the year, and the history there is just remarkable. Right. To see what Norway has and what we've been able to give them, and we're not done.
No, certainly not. And I think that is the theme almost every year, is that this isn't a one-time opportunity. This isn't a one-time operation here. This is something that we're going to work at this year. We're going to learn a lot of things this year. We're going to share a ton of things culturally this year, and then prepare for the next year, because this is a benefit to both organizations.
Yeah, and for decades after that, handshake agreement, we have sent troops over to Norway, and they have sent troops over to us. And we did winter operations training, cold weather survival, tactics, weapons, familiarization, with their equipment. And I think it was at camp, and you can probably say the name a little better because you've been a part of Norway quite a bit, Torpamon in Norway.
Yeah, so, I think that's pretty good. Yeah, your Norwegian's coming out.
Oh yeah, you betcha. Oh yeah, don't you know? And that's cool to be able to go to a base over in Norway and see, and this is not just 5-10 people. This is close to 100 soldiers. 100 people go over there and see it. So they see it, they bring it back, and they tell the younger soldiers, hey, I did this experience. This is great. You should do this. And they come back better soldiers.
Absolutely.
They absolutely do, and they can share that knowledge with some of the people here. And then some of their home guard youth come over here to Camp Ripley, and they see our tactics, our techniques, our procedures. But they also see our culture, right? Which is probably similar to theirs, but we have a bit of a difference.
Yeah, we Americanized it.
Yeah, we Americanized it.
For better or worse, but we Americanized it.
Yeah, we definitely Americanized it, and they love it, and they love coming over here and talking to us, and their leadership loves that we welcome them, and our leadership loves that they welcome us. It is just it's such a great program and such a great partnership. And in the 90s, we created and that was really all just a handshake agreement still for decades. It was just based on a handshake, right? And then in the 90s, when we decided to become more logistically paper-driven, a formal agreement was established. And I think that included the participation of that 100 soldiers and airmen. Let's not forget
our
that
Air National Guard folks.
Yeah, we absolutely have our Air National Guard that they need the winter training as well, and they do great and a great participation with that. And same thing for them. And as the warfare had shifted and things have changed and adversaries have become different.
Always does, right?
Always.
Yeah.
It's always a fluid situation. We did that same thing. The Norwegians would change their training to give us their modern take on winter survival. And we would do the same thing over here. How would Americans survive in the winter?
Right.
How do we train in the winter? And it just shifted all through the 21st century. And then, that brings a sense of family with the Norwegians, right? So when they're in pain, we're in pain. And when we're in pain, they're in pain. Minnesota and Norway have a special bond, I think, because of this program. And a big example of that is in 2011 when they had some terrible domestic terrorism events. The leaders of the exchange opted to introduce their Norwegian soldiers to some cooperative training with the American military, our interagency partners, focusing on how to combat the domestic terrorism,
Right.
Specifically. So the involvement of it, and then us being able to help them out with the problem that they were having, it was just a special thing for everybody. And we actually brought their law enforcement over too and trained them a little bit on it.
Yeah, that's something that the National Guard and the National Guard here in the United States has been doing for decades. Is working with what we're calling today interagency partners, with the state law enforcement, with the local law enforcement. It's, I think even folks here in the States don't have a good grasp on what the National Guard does in support of domestic operations. As law enforcement over the years and whatnot has had the need for the National Guard assistance, they can send that request up, and then by order of the governor, National Guard is deployed. But it isn't an assistance role. It's, the National Guard has never taken over a city of, the city of Minneapolis. We're a supporting role for our civilian partners, and that's for floods and riots and whatever else comes up.
Yeah, we're not a police force,
right?
But we absolutely are able to support and keep some sense of calm and understanding, right? That's what we want to bring. We want to bring public some peace.
Yeah.
We want to be able to be there for our public and our civilians, and that's what our goal is till today.
It is, yeah.
And that's kind of what we were training the Norwegians on, and they were sharing some of their training with their domestic operations with us.
Right.
How to do that and not do it in a police force manner, right?
Right.
Because we are not a police force.
Yeah, that's a model that a lot of countries don't have. It's other countries around the world, it's either one way or the other. When the military comes in, the military's taken over. So it is a model to kind of work off of and develop their own plans for it. How the civilian police force and the military can cooperate.
Yeah, and then during that time, that 2000, from the 90s to 2011, 2001, right? Just a curious time in Minnesota's history, especially, Minnesota, the 34th ID was created back in 91. So
right.
That to be able to share our knowledge and our operational ability to be that sense of calm and peace for the civilian operations, I think really helped them out, and they helped us out at the same time.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, you bring up the reactivation of the 34th Infantry Division and their placement here in Minnesota, taking over for the 47th. That's almost a culture shock all on its own right there. The Viking Division has been around since 46 after World War II. They developed all these plans and procedures and things like that, and now this battle-hardened infantry division from the pages of history comes in and takes over. And then, like you said, I mean, in the late part of the 20th century, a lot of things changed.
Yeah, we shifted from a large-scale operation to a coin-based operation, right? And the really cool thing is everyone loves the Viking Division. The history there is that they did a really good job between 1947 and 91. But you see the Red Bull, and that means something to everybody around the world. That's not just a Minnesota thing or an Iowa thing. That is a worldwide symbol that people recognize. And it's great to have that representation, right? So, we brought him back in 1991, and it was just something cool to be able to see that, and we knew why we brought it back in 91. we had some different things going on in the world, and from the efforts of Minnesota's Adjutant General Ellard Walsh, the division was built from scratch, and veteran transfers and new recruits from Minnesota, North Dakota, and Major General Hendrickson took over command. Back in he was the chief of staff for the 34th Division in North Africa in 1943, and gosh, what a history that guy has.
Right.
He could probably write a book.
He set a lot of precedents in it, and that was still true, 50 years later. The object of the division and the direction of the division and what it's like you said, what it's represented since its creation has been true today just as much as it was back then.
Yeah, I mean, the history of it is just insane, and how it goes from, like you said earlier, the Spanish-American War. We still have the picture over by the DFAC where you have the Red Bull, or the skull, that's just hanging out, and you see all the soldiers just kind of going. And that's a story in itself of how the actual Red Bull was taken, right? Or how it was depicted, how we picked that as our symbol. But, and what people don't realize, and maybe they do realize, but it's not understood, is this is not just a Minnesota division.
Right. Yep.
The division is multiple states, right? So right now we kind of fall under, the headquarters is in Minnesota. Right out in Arden Hills, but Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota, there's soldiers everywhere from different states, and they work really well with us. It's...
Yeah, that's a feather in our cap a little bit to be able to cooperate with states. We give them such a hard time, especially around football season.
Mainly Iowa.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, we don't want to give Iowa too much. We don't want to give Iowa too much credit for that one. I spent a year with them at the 194 FA, and they're really good soldiers and really good people, and they do love being a part. And that relationship between Minnesota and Iowa is special, right? The pig and all that unnecessary crazy talk, but
right.
Even like North Dakota, and when the division was created and kind of ran through that period of peace, it was federalized and sent to Camp Rucker from Alabama 1951 to 54 during the Korean War. Never saw combat. So after that, the Korean War was used as a replacement division, and those soldiers were sent to a regular army. And it just kind of just went away at the 34th ID, and 47th took over, and division's North Dakota elements were transferred out in the 60s and during the service-wide. And we do this every couple of years, right? We start to figure out where the Army is useful and where it's not.
Right.
And how big are we, how small are we? And
where it's going to go. That's yeah.
Yeah, we see it every year. We got to get rid of 13,000 troops or 100 troops or however it works. And after that, we reconfigured it all, and other resignations, making it in the 47th at that time an entirely Minnesotan division. Again, it was reorganized in the 60s, and there was a special little thing that they kind of ran. It's called ROAD, the Reorganization Objective Army Division. And really that was mostly based on the battle group designations, and they were dropped and substituted by battalions, and that's when we went to the battalions, right?
Right.
Assigned flexibly to brigades, and Minnesota, again, is interesting with their brigades because they have a field artillery that reports to a brigade out in Wyoming, which a lot of soldiers have served under. And that was just such a time, those 40s, 50s, and 60s. The military is really trying to figure out how they want to operate in the future. So there's a lot of reorganizing, the 47th, the 34th, the 2nd, the 1st.
And we're experiencing that again now, as the 34th Division is changing again and adding the division artillery back to it.
And the cool thing about now is we're not being replaced or reorganized. We're being grown.
Right.
We're given room to grow. The DeVarty thing is a really amazing and fun thing to be a part of. Having DeVarty finally in National Guard and being that central hub is cool. For me, as a field artillery officer, it's really fun to see and really cool to see that Minnesota is a big key of the future of the Army, specifically.
Yep. And
they trust us in that sense too, right? So then, and that kind of speaks volume to why the 34th was created again in 91 when it was reactivated, and immediately after that, and I'm sure you can speak to a lot of this because you're a Gulf War buff, Former units, all of them, were reactivated 34th ID. The division was renamed, but for the official lineage purposes, the Department of the Army does not recognize the continuity between the 47th and 34th.
Right.
And that's just for simple
There's a
political.
separation there.
Yeah. So we're trying to create that separation, but the 47th was on the rolls longer than any other National Guard division that did not see combat. Right? They supported logistics and training and growth, and that's kind of, in my opinion, why they wanted to go to the 34th. 47th wasn't a battle hardened, like you said earlier. 34th is. So now we have a battle going on overseas. Let's strike some fear into people's hearts and get some history and some lineage. And like it or not, the Army loves their history.
Right.
And they love that symbolism, right? So we throw the 34th out there and the Red Bull, and we tell our history. Nobody messed with the Red Bulls in World War II.
Right. Yeah. During World War II, they spent more days in combat than any other division in the United States Army. And when they deployed again in 2006 to Iraq, again, they spent more days in theater, in combat, than any other Army unit in history. So
yeah, those and even to today, I mean, there's stories out there that there are different units that would paint the Red Bull on their hoods of the Humvee because they knew the enemy would run and hide because there was no holding back when the 34th Red Bull came through. We protected our people and we did our mission, and we always do our mission well. Yep,
absolutely. Coming back to Camp Ripley, though, I mean, as you know, in the post 9/11 era and whatnot, our growth continued. We changed a lot of the training areas that we had here, including the simulated village to support tactical training in close quarters, urban settings. We introduced the improvised explosive device training lanes, medical simulations training centers. A lot of different things like that. We actually brought, the civilian population back into training as an element that our soldiers needed to adapt to and to be concerned with. Because now, here we are. We're not necessarily fighting another army line to line across a battlefield. Now we have to integrate and be a part of these different types of counterinsurgency operations and things like that.
Yeah, which means working with civilians, right? Contractors. Huge part of the Army now. Huge part of the military in general. Contractors. And that's where Minnesota and Camp Ripley specifically is a key piece, is the civilian partners that we have here. Anywhere from the State Patrol to the Department of Homeland Security. We also have local police, first responders, DNR. We have a lot of contractors on base. So not everybody here wears a green suit like me. People like you that wear a uniform, they are mostly retired, and they've worked for the military, but they decided the civilian sector was a better route for them. And we, as green suiters, as we call ourselves, rely upon the expertise of the civilian state partners. And then we can understand when they do need support, like the State Patrol or local police, when they do need support. We can rely upon their training that they've given us. And then we're partners. It's not this...
That relationship is there.
Yeah, it's not a brand new, hey, oh gosh, the military's here. They're trying to take over. No, they understand we're there to support them and help them with their mission at the end of the day. So civilian state partners are just one of the most important things we have here on base. And we love them. We work with them constantly every day. We have communication with them. And, they bring a lot of good ideas that we may not have thought of as well. And we can incorporate that into Camp Ripley and start working with it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it is a big piece. And additionally, we would be remiss if we didn't mention our environmental team, which keeps our flora and fauna working here at Camp Ripley. Otherwise, this place would be a desert by now after 90 years of training and tanks driving all over and artillery firing and things like that. So, maintaining our natural resources and our cultural resources so we can continue to train here.
Yeah, I think we're one of the 7 bases that have that central landscape in the U.S. When we work directly with the Department of Agriculture, we have a whole entire department here dedicated to our environments. The Defense and Interior Department, we focus a lot on conservation. And the big thing downrange, and you can speak to this too, when we slept downrange in tents, you left it as clear as it was when we got there.
Right.
As if you were never there, right? And we have range control that comes out, and they look at it, and it better be clean. If there's trash anywhere on the ground, they will find it,
Right.
and you will clean it up, right? So the environmental team here is such a hardworking team, right? Josh Benton makes his rounds with everybody, and they're trusted. They're a trusted team that work with federal and state partners, and they've won multiple awards. Every year, they seem like they win an award one after another. We have 2 directorates administrating the environmental programs, and Josh does a great job of keeping them in compliance. But you go downrange, it doesn't look like a military base, right?
Right.
We've all been to other bases, and I think this is one of the more beautiful ones. And
Yeah, it's like a state park almost.
absolutely, it's a state park, and keeping some of the history on there. There are certain ruins and historical artifacts out there on Camp Ripley that we protect.
Right.
There are certain, we let the civilian population come on and enjoy the land too. We do archery hunts, we do rifle, musket loading hunts. So we do allow the civilians to come on base and enjoy our environment. And one of the most important pieces of Camp Ripley is our environmental team and how much we focus on those. Yeah.
Well, sir, I think we're coming close to time here. Anything else you want to add about Camp Ripley?
No, I would just keep looking at what we're going to be doing here in the future. Our history is pretty robust. We've got a deep history, and it is interesting. I encourage people to look at it, but we've got a lot of cool things coming up in the future. Continuing that winter training, we've got the biathlon coming up here this year, which is really cool. We partner with high schools to have them do their biathlon meets.
Right.
And no, Camp Ripley is. We're really excited about the new museum coming up too, in a couple of years, and seeing how that grows.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for joining me. Sir, I appreciate a lot of your input and a lot of your background in history. So I thank you for coming on the Ripley Recall. And that concludes our 40 minutes of the Ripley Recall. I was joined by Lieutenant William Hermanson of the Camp Ripley Public Affairs Office. You can find our podcast on a lot of your favorite sites. Go ahead and subscribe and listen in for our next episode.